Sign that, and you'll walk into a trap. Thomas Walker's hand stopped halfway to the document. Then he looked up. What? Thomas said, blinking once, caught off guard. What did you just say? He stared at her, confused. What are you talking about? What trap? The girl swallowed, but she didn't look away. Instead, she lifted her arm and pointed straight at the stack of documents on his desk. Those papers, she said, if you sign them, you'll get trapped. Those projects, they're not real. They're ghost projects. Thomas frowned slightly, not understanding. Ghost projects? She nodded quickly, stepping closer to the desk now, her eyes fixed on the glossy images printed on the top page. I dropped the papers by accident, she said. They were on the floor next to your desk. I picked them up so they wouldn't get dirty. But then they opened, and I saw the pictures. I know that place. My house is near there. Thomas felt something tighten in his chest, but he kept his face calm. And what does that have to do with a trap? Annie pointed at the picture again, perfect little houses, fresh paint, green grass, a bright playground. These houses, she said quietly, they don't look like that in real life. They're broken. Nobody lives there. The windows are covered with wood, and the doors are locked, and the playground is all rusty. They took pictures and fixed them on the computer so it looks new. But it's not new. It's all old and empty. Thomas didn't move. They're trying to trick you, Annie continued, her small finger still resting on the page. If you sign, you'll buy empty houses that nobody fixed. That's the trap. You're telling me, he said carefully, that the houses in these reports don't exist like this? They exist, Annie said, but not like the pictures. They're abandoned. Me and my mom walk past them when we go to the bus. The grass is really tall, and there's a big sign that says new homes coming soon, but the sign is old and falling down. My mom said they stopped building a long time ago. Thomas looked down at the contract again. Evergreen Homes Acquisition. According to the report, construction was nearly finished. According to the numbers, this was a discounted acquisition, a chance to buy a nearly completed housing development at a fraction of the cost. A perfect deal, unless the houses were never finished, unless the pictures were fake, unless someone expected him to sign without ever going there. Before he could ask another question, there was a knock on the door, and it opened almost immediately. Mr. Walker, his secretary, Linda, stepped inside, holding a tablet against her chest. She stopped when she saw Annie standing in front of the desk, but she quickly recovered. I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but the investors are on a conference call in 20 minutes, and Miss Brooks is asking if the contract has been signed. They need the signed copy before the bank closes this afternoon. Thomas didn't answer right away. Linda continued gently, used to busy schedules and million-dollar timing. Legal has already reviewed everything, sir. They said the documents are clean. If we sign today, we secure the acquisition before the other buyers step in. Thomas tapped the closed folder lightly with his finger. Linda, he said calmly, how long has this evergreen project been in development? She thought for a moment. Officially? About 5 years, I think. The previous developer ran out of funding last year, which is why they're selling. 5 years. Thomas looked at Annie. And you're sure no one has been working there recently? Annie nodded. Yes, sir. Nobody. Just wind and trash and broken things. Linda gave a polite, slightly uncomfortable smile. Sir, I'm sure the site reports are accurate. We have inspection photos and progress reports in the file. Everything matches. Photos can be edited, Annie said quietly. Linda looked at her, surprised, as if she had forgotten the child was even in the room. Thomas leaned forward, folded his hands on the desk, and looked at Annie very carefully. Why are you so sure? He asked. You're very young to be talking about traps and fake projects. Annie hesitated, then said something very simple. Because rich people don't walk there, she said. Only people who live there see what it really looks like. Thomas slowly turned his chair toward the window, looking out at the city he had spent his entire adult life trying to conquer. From up here, you couldn't see rusty playgrounds. He turned back to the desk. The contract was still there, his name waiting at the bottom like it always did. Linda spoke again, gently but firmly. Mr. Walker, the bank deadline is in 3 hours. If we don't sign today, the sellers can legally reopen negotiations with other buyers. Mr. Brooks said we might lose the deal. Thomas looked at the pen, then at Annie, then back at the pen. "Linda," he said finally, "call Mr. Brooks and tell him the signing is postponed." Linda blinked, surprised. "Postponed, sir?" "Yes," Thomas said. "I want to visit the site first. There's an official tour scheduled next week." "I don't want an official tour," Thomas said, his voice calm but final. "I want to see it today, unannounced." The room went quiet again. Thomas closed the folder and slid it into his briefcase. Then he looked at Annie. "Can you show me how to get there?" he asked. Annie nodded immediately, like she had been waiting for that question the whole time. Thomas Walker stood up from his desk, the unsigned contract still lying in his briefcase. Thomas Walker did not tell Daniel Brooks he was going to visit the site. That was the first decision he made after Annie left his office that afternoon. At 2 p.m., his phone rang. "Daniel." Thomas looked at the screen for a few seconds before answering. "Thomas," Daniel said, his voice smooth as always. "I just got off the phone with the bank. They're ready to move as soon as we send the signed contract and the deposit transfer. Once the deposit is wired, my team can finalize the ownership paperwork and lock the project under your company's name by tomorrow." Thomas walked slowly to the window, looking down at the traffic far below. "How much is the deposit again?" he asked, though he already knew. $5 million, Daniel replied. "Standard security deposit. It shows commitment. Once we receive it, we start transferring all project rights to Walker Development. But we need your signature and the wire today so my legal team can draft the final ownership contract." Thomas didn't answer right away. He watched a city bus stop at the corner. People getting off. People getting on. Everyone going somewhere. Everyone trusting that the road ahead actually existed. "Thomas," Daniel said, "we're on a tight timeline. There are other buyers sniffing around this project. If we don't move now, we could lose the deal." Thomas turned away from the window and sat down slowly at his desk. The contract was still in his briefcase. Annie's crayon map was folded neatly beside it. "I'm not wiring the deposit today," Thomas said calmly. Silence. Then Daniel spoke again, slower this time. "I'm sorry. What do you mean?" "I mean," Thomas said, "I'll sign the contract after I visit the site. Then I'll transfer the deposit." Another pause, but this one felt colder. "Thomas," Daniel said, "with all due respect, we've already provided inspection reports, development photos, city approvals, engineering summaries. There's nothing you're going to see there that isn't already in the file." "Maybe," Thomas said, "but I still want to see it." "You don't trust the reports?" "I trust what I see with my own eyes," Thomas replied. Daniel exhaled slowly into the phone. "If you delay this, the sellers might think you're backing out. That could damage the relationship. In this business, reputation matters." Thomas almost smiled at that. "So does truth," he said. "All right," Daniel said finally. "If it makes you comfortable, I can arrange a site visit. I'll have the project manager meet you there. We'll bring the latest progress documents. We can walk the entire property together and answer any questions you have." "That won't be necessary," he said. "I'll go by myself, just to take a quick look. After that, we'll talk about signing." There was a very small pause on the other end. Very small. But Thomas noticed it. "Well," Daniel said, "just let me know when you want to go. I'll make sure the site office is open." "I'll let you know," Thomas said, but he already knew he wouldn't. They ended the call, and Thomas sat in silence for a long time, the phone still in his hand. He had done business with men like Daniel for 20 years. Good suits, clean documents, perfect timing, always pushing for the signature before sunset. And now they wanted the deposit before he even saw the land. He opened his briefcase, took out Annie's map again, and smoothed the paper on his desk. A big road, a broken streetlight, a gas station, a fence, a hole in the fence where people walked in, a map for a $5 million decision drawn by a child. At 6:15 p.m., Thomas's SUV pulled away from the office building with Annie and her mother inside, just like he had promised. He did not tell his driver. He did not tell his assistant, and he definitely did not tell Daniel. He drove himself. They left the business district and headed toward the older part of the city, Annie leaning forward between the seats, giving directions like a tiny navigator. "Go straight, then turn right at the store with the red sign, then keep going until you see a broken light. Thomas followed every instruction quietly. He didn't turn on the car's navigation system. He didn't want a digital record of where he was going. After about 25 minutes, Annie suddenly said, "Slow down. It's close now." Thomas slowed the car. The road here was uneven, patched and cracked. A street light ahead leaned slightly to one side, the glass broken on one side of the lamp. "That one," Annie said, pointing. "That's the broken light I told you about." Thomas pulled over near a chain-link fence. In front of the fence stood a large sign, "Evergreen Homes, a new community is coming." But the sign was faded, the colors washed out by sun and rain. The bottom of the sign was stained dark green, like it had been standing there for years. Thomas turned off the engine, but he didn't get out right away. He just sat there, looking through the windshield at the rows of houses behind the fence. From far away, they almost looked like the pictures in the report. "Almost. Come," Annie said softly. "I'll show you the playground." They got out of the car and walked along the fence. When they reached the playground, Thomas stopped walking. The slide was not blue. It was brown with rust, the paint peeling off in long strips. The swings had no seats, only chains hanging down, moving slightly in the wind. He walked closer to the fence and looked at the houses. Some windows were covered with plywood. Some doors were crooked. There were no construction materials, no trucks, no workers, no sound of hammers, no smell of fresh wood or paint. He took out his phone and opened the project photos Daniel had sent him earlier that week. Bright blue slide, fresh paint, clean sidewalks, new roofs. Thomas held the phone up, matching the angle of the photo with the real houses in front of him. Same houses, different reality. Behind him, Annie said quietly, "They fixed the pictures so people who never come here will think it's already built." Thomas lowered the phone slowly. He looked at the empty houses, the broken playground, the faded sign that promised a future that had clearly never come. Then he thought about Daniel's voice on the phone. "Wire the deposit first. We'll finalize the contract after." Thomas slipped the phone back into his pocket and stood there in the wind, staring through the fence at the silent neighborhood. A trap didn't always look like a trap. Sometimes, it looked like a good investment. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your story matters, and we would love to hear where in the world this message reached you. And if you believe stories about truth, justice, and second chances still matter, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next story. Thomas Walker did not speak for a long time after they returned to the car. Annie and her mother sat quietly, as if they understood that whatever he had just seen had changed something inside him. The sky was already turning dark, and the broken houses behind the fence slowly disappeared into shadows as the last light faded. Thomas finally started the engine, but he didn't drive right away. His hands rested on the steering wheel, and he kept looking straight ahead at the faded sign, "Evergreen Homes, a new community is coming." "Sir?" Annie's mother said gently. "Are you okay?" Thomas nodded once, still looking at the sign. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm okay." But he wasn't okay. He had built his entire life on one rule: never sign what you don't understand. And today, he had almost signed something that didn't even exist. He drove Annie and her mother home first. Their apartment building was old but clean, the kind of place where people worked hard just to keep things decent. When they stopped in front of the building, Annie unbuckled her seatbelt but didn't open the door yet. "Are you still going to buy the houses?" she asked. Thomas looked at her in the rearview mirror. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I know one thing." "What?" Annie asked. "I'm very glad you dropped those papers." Annie smiled a little, then got out of the car with her mother. Before closing the door, she leaned back in and said something that stayed with Thomas long after he drove away. "My mom says if someone is in a hurry for you to sign something, it usually helps them, not you." Thomas nodded slowly. "Your mom is a smart woman." "She had to be," Annie said. "Nobody ever helped her." Then she closed the door and ran up the stairs to the building, her small backpack bouncing against her back. Thomas sat in the car for another minute, watching the front door close behind them. Then he drove away, but instead of going home, he drove back toward downtown, toward his office, toward the contract still sitting in his briefcase like a loaded gun. When he reached his office, it was almost 9 p.m. The building was quiet now, most of the lights off. only the cleaning crews moving slowly through the hallways. He went into his office, closed the door, and placed the briefcase on his desk. For a long moment, he didn't open it. He just stood there, looking at the city through the glass wall. Finally, he opened the briefcase and took out the Evergreen Homes contract. He placed it on the desk, then placed Annie's crayon map next to it. A professional contract written by lawyers, a map drawn by a 6-year-old, and somehow, the map was more honest. His phone rang. Daniel. Thomas looked at the phone, then answered. Thomas, Daniel said, I didn't hear from you, so I wanted to check in. Did you have a chance to review the contract again? If you sign tonight, we can still process the deposit first thing in the morning. Thomas walked slowly around his desk and sat down. I visited the site, he said. There was a very small pause on the line. Oh? Daniel said. You didn't tell me you were going. I wanted to see it the way it really is, Thomas replied. Well, Daniel said lightly. Then you saw the potential. The location is excellent. Once renovations are complete, that place will triple in value. Thomas looked down at the photo in the report: bright houses, clean playground, green lawns. Daniel, Thomas said quietly. When were you last physically at that site? Another pause. Longer this time. My project managers are there every week, Daniel said. I get daily updates. That's not what I asked, Thomas said. When were you there? Daniel didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed slightly. Less friendly now. More careful. Thomas, in this business, we rely on teams. We can't personally visit every property. The playground is rusted, Thomas said calmly. The swings don't have seats. The windows are boarded up. There are no workers, no materials, no construction. The sign out front looks like it's been there for 10 years. Silence. Thomas leaned back in his chair, the phone pressed to his ear. The pictures in your report, Thomas continued, are either very old or not real. Daniel exhaled slowly. Thomas, you have to understand, development projects go through phases. Some areas look rough before the final stage. That's normal. No, Thomas said. What's not normal is asking for a $5 million deposit on a project that looks abandoned. Daniel didn't speak for a few seconds. Then his voice came back, smoother again, like he had decided to change strategy. Thomas, he said, let me be honest with you. Yes, the previous developer ran out of money. Yes, the site needs more work than the report shows. That's exactly why this is such a good deal. You're buying low. That's how you make real money in real estate. Thomas listened, but he didn't say anything. You of all people should understand this, Daniel continued. You didn't become a billionaire by buying perfect projects. You became a billionaire by buying problems and turning them into profit. Evergreen is a problem, but it's a profitable problem if you move fast. Move fast. Wire the deposit first. Sign before visiting. Thomas looked again at Annie's map on his desk. Daniel, he said slowly, I'm not signing anything. Not yet. The silence on the other end this time was cold. You're making a mistake, Daniel said quietly. Thomas replied just as quietly. No. I think I almost made one. He ended the call and placed the phone on the desk. Then he opened his laptop and began searching public property records, zoning maps, old development permits, everything he could find about Evergreen Homes. If this was a real project, there would be a paper trail. Permits. Inspections. Contractor licenses. Something. An hour passed. Then 2. The more he searched, the more something didn't make sense. Permits that expired years ago. Contractors that no longer existed. Inspection reports signed by companies that had dissolved. Thomas leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He had seen bad deals before. He had seen dishonest partners before. But this felt different. This didn't feel like a struggling project. This felt like something built to look real just long enough for someone to sign and wire money. Thomas looked at the contract one more time, then slowly closed the folder and locked it in his desk drawer. Then he said out loud, to the empty office, this isn't a renovation project. He paused, thinking about the empty houses, the fake photos, the pressure to wire money quickly. This is a setup. Thomas Walker did not go home that night. After locking the Evergreen contract in his desk drawer, he stayed in his office, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass like 1,000 silent witnesses. He loosened his tie, poured himself a cup of black coffee from the machine in the corner, and sat back down at his desk. If this was a setup, then someone had built it carefully. No one asks for a $5 million deposit on a half-dead project unless they are either desperate or dishonest. And Daniel Brooks was not a desperate man. He was polished, patient, and very careful with his words. Thomas opened his laptop again and began digging deeper. He searched property tax records first. Evergreen Homes had not paid full property tax in 3 years. The records showed repeated extensions, restructuring, and something called temporary development deferment. That usually meant one thing. The project had stalled a long time ago. Then he searched the construction company listed in the report Green River Build Group. The company website existed. Clean, professional, photos of modern buildings, smiling workers in hard hats. But when Thomas checked the business registration number, the company had officially closed 2 years ago. Closed. Yet their name was still signing inspection reports in Daniel's file. Thomas leaned back slowly in his chair, feeling that cold, familiar feeling in his chest. The feeling he got when he realized someone was trying to play him. He picked up his phone and called someone he trusted. "Frank," Thomas said when the man answered. "I need a favor." Frank Doyle had been a city building inspector for 30 years before retiring. He knew permits, zoning tricks, fake contractors, and every legal shortcut developers tried to use. If Evergreen was a real project, Frank would know. If it was fake, Frank would know even faster. Thomas Walker asking for a favor usually means trouble, Frank said with a dry laugh. "What did you find?" Thomas explained everything: the abandoned houses, the fake-looking photos, the pressure to wire the deposit, the expired permits. Frank didn't interrupt once. When Thomas finished, Frank was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "Don't sign anything." Thomas almost smiled at that. "That's exactly what a 6-year-old told me yesterday." "Well," Frank said, "sounds like that kid has better instincts than half the developers I used to work with." "You ever heard of Evergreen Homes?" Thomas asked. Another pause, but this time it was the pause of someone thinking, not hiding. "Yeah," Frank said slowly. "I know that place." Thomas straightened in his chair. "Tell me." "That project died years ago," Frank said. "Original developer ran out of money. City pulled some permits. Investors sued each other. Whole thing turned into a legal mess. Last I heard, the land ownership was tied up between 3 different companies, and the city transportation department wanted part of the land for a future road expansion." Thomas's hand tightened around the phone. "So nobody owns it cleanly?" "Not last time I checked," Frank said. "Why?" "Because someone is trying to sell it to me like it's a clean, nearly finished project," Thomas said. Frank let out a low whistle. "Then someone's either lying or planning to disappear with your deposit." Thomas stood up and walked to the window again, looking out over the city. "What happens?" Thomas asked quietly, "if I sign and wire the deposit on a property with ownership disputes and expired permits?" Frank didn't hesitate. "Best case? You spend years in court trying to get your money back. Worst case? The company you wired the money to files bankruptcy and vanishes, and you never see that money again." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. $5 million wouldn't destroy him. But that wasn't the point. The point was someone thought he was stupid enough to fall for it. "Frank," Thomas said, "I need copies of every public record on Evergreen. Ownership, zoning, permits, lawsuits, everything. And I need it quiet." "You think this is fraud?" Frank asked. Thomas looked at the contract, locked in his drawer. "I think," Thomas said slowly, "someone built a very expensive ghost town, and now they're trying to sell me the ghost." The next morning, Thomas arrived at the office earlier than usual. The building was still quiet. Just the cleaning crew moving through the hallways with carts and mops. He walked into his office and found Linda already waiting outside the door, holding a tablet and a stack of messages. "Good morning, sir," she said. "Mr. Brooks called twice last night, and once this morning. He says the sellers are getting nervous and need confirmation that we're moving forward. The bank also emailed about the wire transfer authorization." Thomas nodded and opened his office door. "Tell the bank to hold the transfer." Linda hesitated. "Completely, sir?" "Completely," Thomas said. "No deposit. Not yet." She nodded. making a note on the tablet. Yes, sir. As she turned to leave, Thomas said, Linda, how long have you worked for me? She looked surprised by the question. 11 years, sir. In those 11 years, Thomas said, how many deals have you seen me rush? She thought for a moment. None, sir. You usually slow everyone else down. Thomas nodded. There's a reason for that. I know, Linda said. You always say the deal you rush into is the deal you regret. Thomas gave a small smile. Looks like I taught you something. She smiled back politely and left the office. An hour later, Daniel Brooks walked in without an appointment. Thomas saw him through the glass wall before the door even opened. Perfect suit, confident walk, the smile already prepared. Thomas, Daniel said, stepping into the office like nothing was wrong. I think we need to talk. Thomas didn't stand up. We're talking. Daniel sat down across from the desk and placed a thin folder on the table. These are updated financial projections. If you're worried about the renovation costs, we can adjust the numbers. But we really need to finalize this deal this week. Thomas looked at the folder but didn't open it. Who actually owns Evergreen Homes right now, Daniel? Daniel blinked once, just once, but Thomas saw it. The development company, Daniel said smoothly. Evergreen Residential Holdings. Thomas nodded slowly. And who owns the land title? The same company, Daniel replied. Thomas opened a drawer, took out a printed document Frank had emailed him 30 minutes earlier, and slid it across the desk. Daniel looked down at it. It was a city record showing that the land was tied up in a legal dispute between Evergreen Residential Holdings, a bank, and the city transportation department. 3 owners. Ongoing dispute. No clear title. Daniel didn't touch the paper for a few seconds. Then he looked up at Thomas. For the first time since they had met, Daniel Brooks wasn't smiling. You went digging, Daniel said quietly. Thomas leaned back in his chair. I went to see what I was buying. Daniel held his gaze for a long moment. Then he said something that sounded less like a business pitch and more like a warning. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be, Thomas. Thomas replied just as calmly. No, I think I'm finally seeing how complicated it already is. Daniel Brooks did not touch the document for a long time. He just looked at it, then at Thomas, then back at the document again. The silence in the office felt heavy now, like the air had changed weight. Finally, Daniel leaned back in the chair and let out a slow breath. The friendly investor smile was gone. What replaced it was something colder, more calculating. Where did you get this? Daniel asked. Public records, Thomas said. Amazing what you can find when you look past the sales brochure. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he had expected this moment might come eventually. You should have come to me, he said. We could have talked about this. We are talking about it, Thomas replied. Daniel tapped the document lightly with one finger. Yes. There's a dispute over part of the land, he said, but that's normal in large developments. These things get resolved all the time. Lawyers negotiate, banks get paid, the city signs off. That's how development works. Not before I wire $5 million, Thomas said. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city the same way Thomas often did. You know, Daniel said, I've always respected you, Thomas. You started with nothing, built an empire, never inherited a dollar. Men like us, we don't get many chances to jump ahead. We have to take risks when we see them. Thomas watched him carefully but said nothing. Daniel turned back toward him. Evergreen is a risk, I won't lie about that, but it's also an opportunity. The city wants that area developed. The bank wants to get rid of the property. The original investors want out. Everyone is tired. That's when smart money comes in and takes control. And that smart money is supposed to be me, Thomas said. Daniel gave a small smile. You said it, not me. Thomas folded his hands on the desk. You asked for the deposit before telling me the land ownership is in dispute. I didn't lie, Daniel said quickly. I just didn't think the legal structure mattered at this stage. It matters when my name and my money are on the paper, Thomas replied. Daniel walked back to the chair but didn't sit down this time. He stood with both hands resting on the back of the chair, leaning slightly forward. Let me be very clear, Daniel said. If you don't move on this now, someone else will, and when the legal issues clear, and they will clear, this project will be worth 3 times what you pay today. You'll watch someone else make a fortune on a deal that was sitting right in front of you. Thomas nodded slowly. Maybe. Daniel studied his face, trying to read him. So what do you want? He asked. More documents? More guarantees? We can restructure the deal, reduce the deposit, bring in another partner. I'm flexible, Thomas, but I need to know you're still in. Thomas stood up now, and the two men faced each other across the desk. What I want, Thomas said, is the truth. Not the sales version, not the investor version, the real version. Daniel held his gaze for a long moment. Then he said quietly, the real version is this. The project failed, the land is a legal mess. The previous investors lost money, and the only way anyone gets paid is if someone new comes in, takes control, and finishes it. And if the legal mess never clears? Thomas asked. Daniel shrugged slightly. Then it becomes a long-term hold. You sit on the land, wait for the city to expand, sell it later. Either way, the land has value. Thomas walked around the desk and stopped a few feet from Daniel. You're not trying to sell me a housing project, Thomas said. You're trying to sell me a problem. Daniel didn't deny it. Every big profit starts as a problem, Daniel said. Thomas nodded slowly. Yes, but the difference between a problem and a trap is whether the man buying it knows the truth before he signs. The room went quiet again. After a moment, Daniel straightened his jacket and picked up the document from the desk. So, he said, are you in or out? Thomas didn't answer immediately. He walked back to his chair, sat down, and looked at the city again through the glass wall. When I was 25, Thomas said, I bought my first property. Small, ugly building. Everyone told me it was a terrible deal. Bad neighborhood, bad tenants, bad structure. But I bought it anyway. Daniel waited. You know why I bought it? Thomas asked. Because you saw potential, Daniel said. Thomas shook his head slightly. No. Because I understood exactly what was wrong with it. Every broken pipe, every unpaid bill, every legal issue. I knew the worst before I signed. So nothing surprised me later. He turned his chair back toward Daniel. With Evergreen, Thomas continued. I don't think I know the worst yet. And that makes it dangerous. Daniel looked at him carefully. Business is always dangerous. Not like this, Thomas said. This feels like someone is in a hurry for me to sign before I ask the right questions. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. You're overthinking this. Thomas almost smiled. Overthinking has saved me more money than fast decisions ever did. Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then finally nodded once, like a man accepting that the conversation had reached the end of one road. All right, Daniel said. You want time? I'll give you time. But not forever. The sellers won't wait forever. He turned and walked toward the door, then stopped with his hand on the handle. One more thing, Thomas, Daniel said without turning around. In this business, hesitation can cost you a fortune, Thomas replied calmly, and rushing can cost you everything. Daniel stood there for a second longer, then opened the door and walked out. Thomas remained seated, staring at the closed door. After a few minutes, he opened the desk drawer again and took out the Evergreen contract. He placed it on the desk and looked at his name printed at the bottom of the signature page. Then he thought about Annie standing in his office, pointing at the file and saying, those projects are ghost projects. Ghost projects. Thomas picked up a pen and wrote 2 words across the top of the contract in large, clear letters. Find out. Then he closed the folder again, because now this wasn't just a business deal anymore. Now it was an investigation. The next morning, Thomas Walker changed the way he worked. For years, he had been the man people came to when they wanted a deal approved. His office was the final door. His signature was the final step. But now, for the first time in a long time, he was no longer the man finishing a deal. He was the man taking one apart. He arrived at the office before sunrise, long before the elevators filled with suits and briefcases. The city was still gray and half asleep, steam rising from the streets, traffic lights blinking over empty intersections. Linda was already at her desk when he walked in. She had a coffee ready for him, just the way he liked it, black, no sugar. Good morning, sir, she said. Mr. Brooks called again. He wants an answer about the deposit by the end of the week. He says the sellers are starting to look at other buyers. Thomas took the coffee and nodded. Of course they are. Linda hesitated, then asked carefully, "Are we still considering the deal?" Thomas looked at her for a moment, then said, "Linda, have you ever heard of a ghost project?" She frowned slightly. "No, sir. It's a project that exists on paper, in presentations, in financial projections, but not in real life," Thomas said. "Or at least not the way it's described." Linda was quiet for a second. "Is Evergreen one of those?" Thomas didn't answer directly. "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." He walked into his office and closed the door, then picked up the phone and called Frank again. "I need more than public records," Thomas said. "I need the story. Who owned Evergreen first? Who lost money? Who sued who? And who is trying to sell it now?" Frank chuckled softly. "You really stepped into something, didn't you?" "Feels like it," Thomas said. "All right," Frank replied. "Give me a day. I still know people at City Hall." "But Thomas, if this is what I think it is, you're not just looking at a bad deal. You're looking at people who don't want that deal examined too closely." "I'm not afraid of paperwork," Thomas said. "I'm not talking about paperwork," Frank replied quietly. After the call ended, Thomas sat in silence for a while, thinking about that sentence. People who don't want that deal examined too closely. At 10:30 a.m., he called Annie's mother. He had saved her number the night he drove them home, though he wasn't sure why at the time. Now he knew. "Mrs. Carter, this is Thomas Walker," he said when she answered. "Oh, Mr. Walker," she said, surprised. "Is everything all right?" "I just wanted to ask you something," Thomas said. "How long have you lived near Evergreen Homes?" "Almost 3 years," she replied. "Why? Has anyone been working there in that time?" Thomas asked. "No," she said immediately. "Not really. Sometimes a truck comes, stays for a day or two, then leaves again. They put up a new sign once, maybe last year, but nothing changed. Kids sometimes sneak in to play, but it's mostly empty." Thomas wrote that down on a notepad. "Do people in the neighborhood think the houses will be finished one day?" he asked. She gave a small, sad laugh. "People have been saying one day about that place for years. Around here, we don't believe in those signs anymore." After he hung up, Thomas looked at the words he had written. "No workers. Truck sometimes. New sign. Nothing changed. People don't believe anymore. A project that shows just enough activity to look alive, but never actually moves forward." That afternoon, Frank called back. "I found something," he said. "You're not going to like it." "Tell me anyway," Thomas replied. "The original Evergreen project started almost 8 years ago," Frank said. "A company called Horizon Urban Development bought the land and announced a low-income housing community. The city supported it. Banks financed it. Investors put money in." "What happened?" Thomas asked. "They ran out of money halfway through construction," Frank said. "Then the lawsuit started. Contractors said they weren't paid. Investors said the company lied about costs. The bank froze funding. The city pulled some permits because construction stopped too long." Thomas leaned forward in his chair. "And the land? That's where it gets messy," Frank said. "The bank took part of it. The city claimed a portion for future road expansion. The original company went bankrupt. Then the land got split into different parcels, different owners, different legal claims. It's been tied up in court and paperwork ever since." "And Evergreen Residential Holdings?" Thomas asked. "The company Daniel says owns it now?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "That company was created 2 years ago," he said. "And you know who's listed as a senior partner?" Thomas already knew the answer before Frank said it. "Daniel Brooks." Thomas leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "So he's not just the middleman," Thomas said quietly. "He's one of the owners." "Looks that way," Frank said. "Which means if you wire that deposit, the money doesn't just go into a project. It goes into a company he's connected to." Thomas didn't speak for a long moment. He thought about Daniel sitting in his office, talking about opportunity, about risk, about moving fast. He thought about the abandoned houses, the fake photos, the pressure to wire money before asking questions. Then he said quietly, "He's not trying to sell me a project." "No," Frank said. "He's trying to sell you his problem." After the call ended, Thomas walked to the window again. The city looked the same as it always did, busy, loud, full of people trying to build something, fix something, survive something. But now he understood the shape of the trap. Evergreen wasn't a housing project. It was a financial hole. And Daniel Brooks wanted him to jump in first. Thomas Walker did not call Daniel for 3 days. That alone told Daniel something was wrong. In business, silence is rarely empty. Silence is usually a decision being made somewhere you can't see. During those 3 days, Thomas did not attend investor lunches, did not review new projects, did not approve any acquisitions. Instead, he did something he had not done in years. He started checking everything himself. He visited the county records office in person, not sending an assistant, not asking a lawyer. He sat at a public computer like any other citizen and searched property transfers, bankruptcy filings, lien records, and zoning maps connected to Evergreen. What he found made the story clearer and uglier. Evergreen Residential Holdings, the company Daniel said owned the project, did not buy the land in a normal purchase. They bought development rights from the bankrupt company for a very small amount of money. But those rights did not include full land ownership. The bank still held part of the mortgage. The city still held part of the land for future road expansion, and several contractors still had unpaid claims tied to the property. It was not one problem. It was a pile of problems stacked on top of each other, all waiting for someone with deep pockets to step in and solve them. Someone like Thomas Walker. On the 4th day, Daniel finally showed up again. This time, he didn't smile when he walked into the office. "You've been very quiet," Daniel said, closing the door behind him. "I've been very busy," Thomas replied. Daniel sat down without being invited. "I heard you've been asking questions. County records, zoning office, even talked to some people at City Hall." Thomas looked at him calmly. "You've been asking questions about me too, I assume." Daniel didn't deny it. "That's how business works." Thomas nodded. "Then let's stop pretending this is a normal deal." Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair, studying him. "All right," he said. "No more pretending. What do you want to know?" "I want to know," Thomas said, "how much money Evergreen has already swallowed." Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back at Thomas. "Over the years," Daniel said, "probably 40 million. Maybe more. And you want me to put in 5 more, Thomas said. "I want you to take control," Daniel corrected. "With your company, your reputation, your lawyers, your connections, you could untangle the legal mess, negotiate with the city, settle with the bank, finish construction, and turn it into a profitable development. You'd be the man who saved Evergreen." Thomas almost smiled at that. "You don't need a partner," Thomas said. "You need a rescuer." Daniel didn't argue. "Maybe," he said quietly. Thomas stood up and walked slowly across the office, then turned back to face him. "Here's what I think happened," Thomas said. "You and some investors bought the development rights cheap, hoping you could fix the project and make a fortune. But the legal problems were bigger than you thought. The bank wanted money. The city wanted land. The contractors wanted to be paid. And the project stopped again." Daniel said nothing. "So now," Thomas continued, "you need someone bigger to step in, someone with enough money and influence to clean up the mess. If I sign and wire the deposit, I become that someone." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly right." The honesty hung in the air between them. "And what happens to my 5 million the moment I wire it?" Thomas asked. "It goes into Evergreen Residential Holdings," Daniel said. "We use it to settle some urgent debts, restart permits, and show the city the project is alive again." "So my money goes in first," Thomas said. "And all the old problems get paid with my money." "That's how turnarounds work," Daniel said. Thomas walked back to his desk and sat down. "You should have told me the truth from the beginning," he said. "If I had told you the whole truth on day 1, Daniel replied, "you never would have come to look at the project." Thomas thought about that, then nodded slowly. "You're right. I wouldn't have." Daniel leaned forward now, his voice more intense. "But now you have seen it," Daniel said. "You've seen the location. You know what land is worth in that area. You know that in 10 years, that neighborhood will be worth a fortune. This is not a scam, Thomas. This is a broken project, and broken projects are where the biggest money is." Thomas looked at him carefully. "There's just one problem." "What?" Daniel asked. You tried to rush me, Thomas said. You asked for the deposit before telling me the truth. That makes it feel like a trap, not a partnership. Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but Thomas raised a hand slightly. Let me finish, Thomas said. If you had walked into this office on the first day and said, Thomas, this project is a disaster, the ownership is a mess, the bank is angry, the city is involved, and we need a strong partner to save it, I might have listened very differently. Daniel sat back slowly. But instead, Thomas continued, you showed me pretty pictures, clean reports, and asked me to wire $5 million quickly. That's not how partners talk. That's how salesmen talk. Daniel didn't look angry now. He looked tired. Do you know how many people I talked to before you? Daniel asked quietly. Do you know how many doors I walked into? How many people told me the project was dead, that I should walk away and take the loss? Thomas didn't answer. I can't walk away, Daniel said. Too many people already lost money. If this project dies completely, dozens of small investors lose everything. Contractors never get paid. That neighborhood stays half-built and abandoned for another 10 years. Thomas studied his face, trying to decide if this was another sales pitch or the truth. So you're not just trying to save your investment, Thomas said. You're trying to save yourself. Daniel held his gaze. Yes. The room went quiet again. After a long moment, Thomas said, I'm not saying yes, and I'm not saying no. Daniel frowned slightly. Then what are you saying? I'm saying, Thomas replied, that if I step into this, I do it my way. Full access to every document, every lawsuit, every debt, every contract, my lawyers, my auditors, my inspectors, and no money moves until I know exactly where every dollar is going. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Finally, he nodded slowly. That's fair. Thomas leaned back in his chair. And one more thing. What? Daniel asked. If I find out that anyone lied to me about anything connected to Evergreen, Thomas said calmly, I walk away, and I don't walk away quietly. Daniel looked at him and, for the first time, seemed to understand something important. Thomas Walker was no longer a potential buyer. He was becoming the most dangerous kind of man in business, a man who was looking for the truth. On Monday morning, Daniel Brooks delivered everything: boxes of documents, digital files, contracts, court records, bank letters, city notices, engineering reports, unpaid invoices, legal disputes, environmental assessments, insurance claims. The Evergreen project was no longer a glossy brochure on Thomas Walker's desk. It was a mountain of paper. Thomas didn't assign the files to his junior staff. He didn't send them straight to legal and wait for a summary. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone in the company. He built a war room. In a large conference room on the 18th floor, he had whiteboards installed on every wall. Long tables were covered with files. Maps of the Evergreen property were printed and pinned up. Different colored markers were lined up like surgical tools. At the center of the main whiteboard, Thomas wrote 2 words in large black letters: Evergreen, truth. Under it, he drew 3 columns: land, money, people, because in Thomas Walker's world, every problem was always one of those 3 things. And usually, the real problem was where all 3 met. For the next several days, Thomas and a small team he trusted worked through the documents piece by piece. The land column filled up first. Parcel A, owned partly by the bank. Parcel B, development rights owned by Evergreen Residential Holdings. Parcel C, city reserved land for future road expansion. Environmental restrictions near the drainage area. Expired building permits. Partially approved renovation permits. Zoning classification changed twice in 8 years. It's not one project, one of his lawyers said. It's 3 different projects pretending to be one. Thomas nodded and wrote on the board. Not one project, 3 problems. Then they moved to the money column. Original investor funds, gone. Bank loan, unpaid. Contractor invoices, unpaid. Legal fees, ongoing. Property taxes, partially unpaid. Security and maintenance, minimal spending just to keep the site from being condemned. New money needed to restart construction, estimated $18 to $22 million. Thomas circled that number slowly. If he stepped into Evergreen, It wouldn't cost 5 million. It would cost more than 20. Then they moved to the people column. Original developer. Bankrupt. Bank wants their money back. City wants road access and affordable housing units. Contractors want unpaid invoices settled. Investors want to recover losses. Evergreen Residential Holdings, controlled by Daniel Brooks and two silent partners. Thomas underlined that last line. Find out who the silent partners are, he said. By Thursday afternoon, the whiteboards were full. Lines connected names to debts, debts to land parcels to lawsuits, lawsuits to companies, companies back to people. It looked less like a housing project and more like a crime investigation board. That evening, after everyone else left, Thomas remained alone in the war room. The lights were dim, the city glowing outside the windows, and the whiteboards full of problems stared back at him. He walked slowly along the wall, reading everything again. Then he saw something that bothered him. Maintenance and security expenses, he said quietly to himself. He flipped through one of the financial folders again. Every year, Evergreen Residential Holdings spent a small amount of money on site activity, security patrols, occasional cleanup, temporary fencing repairs, sign replacement, and inspection photography. Inspection photography. Thomas remembered the photos in Daniel's report: bright houses, clean sidewalks, blue playground. He picked up the phone and called Frank again. Frank, he said. How easy is it to make an abandoned construction site look active for a camera? Frank laughed once. Very easy. You send a crew for 2 days, cut the grass, paint one house, bring in a truck, take photos from the right angle, then everyone leaves again. Thomas looked at the photo of the bright blue playground in the report. And if someone did that once a year? Thomas asked. Then on paper, Frank said, it looks like the project is still moving. Thomas hung up slowly and looked back at the board. Under money, he wrote, project kept alive on paper. Then he stepped back and looked at the entire wall. Land problems, money problems, legal problems, and a project that was being kept just alive enough to sell to the next investor. Thomas whispered quietly. They weren't building houses. He paused, looking at the lines connecting everything. They were building a story. The next day, he met Daniel again in the war room. Daniel walked in, looked at the whiteboards, and stopped. You've been busy, Daniel said. Thomas nodded. So have you. For 2 years, Daniel walked slowly along the wall, reading the notes, the connections, the numbers. You missed one thing, Daniel said finally. Thomas looked at him. What? Daniel pointed to the people column. You wrote that I'm trying to save myself. Thomas crossed his arms. Aren't you? Daniel looked at the board for a long moment before answering. I'm trying to save the project, he said. Because if this project dies, that entire neighborhood stays like that for another 10 years. Half-built houses, empty lots, falling fences. No one else is coming to fix it. Thomas. No one. Banks don't build neighborhoods. Cities don't build neighborhoods. People like us do. Thomas studied his face carefully. Daniel looked tired, but he didn't look like a man who thought he was lying. You should have told me the truth at the beginning, Thomas said again. I know, Daniel replied, but nobody invests in a disaster. They invest in a vision, so we showed them a vision. Thomas looked back at the photo of the bright houses, then at the photo he had taken himself of the rusted playground. A vision is one thing, Thomas said quietly. A lie is another. Daniel didn't respond. After a long silence, Thomas said, There's still one thing I don't understand. What? Daniel asked. Thomas picked up a marker and circled one line on the board. Silent partners, unknown. If this project is such a disaster, Thomas said, why haven't your partners forced you to sell the development rights and walk away? Why keep this thing alive for 2 years, paying maintenance, taking photos, showing it to investors? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Thomas watched him carefully. Because, Thomas said slowly, someone still believes there's a big payoff at the end of this. Daniel finally looked at him. Yes, he said quietly. There is. Thomas waited. Daniel hesitated, then said something he clearly had not planned to say that day. The city's new highway expansion plan, Daniel said. The one that hasn't been publicly announced yet. If that road goes through, the land around Evergreen triples in value overnight. Thomas felt something cold move through his chest. So that's the real project, Thomas said. Daniel didn't deny it. It was never just about the houses, Daniel said quietly. It was about the land. Thomas Walker did not respond immediately after Daniel said the word land. He walked slowly to the whiteboard and looked again at the map of Evergreen and the surrounding area. Roads, drainage lines, empty lots, industrial land, old neighborhoods, and then he remembered something Frank had said days earlier. The city transportation department wanted part of the land for a future road expansion. Thomas picked up a red marker and drew a long line across the map where a highway might logically pass if the city expanded traffic flow from the industrial district toward the interstate. The red line cut very close to Evergreen. Very close. He turned slowly back to Daniel. How long have you known about the highway plan? Thomas asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. That was answer enough. 2 years? Thomas asked. Daniel nodded once. About that. And your silent partners? Thomas asked. They know too? Yes. Thomas looked back at the board again. Now everything looked different. The abandoned houses, the yearly maintenance, the staged photos, the attempt to keep the project looking alive, the push to bring in new investors. They weren't trying to flip houses. They were trying to hold the land until the highway announcement made it explode in value. So the real plan, Thomas said slowly, is not to finish the houses. The real plan is to control the land when the highway gets approved. Daniel didn't deny it. The houses were the original plan. The land became the new plan. Thomas nodded slowly. And you need money to survive until that announcement becomes public. Yes, Daniel said. Property taxes, legal fees, maintenance, interest payments to the bank. This project bleeds money every month. If we lose control of the land before the highway announcement, the bank takes it, or the city takes it, and all of it was for nothing. Thomas turned and leaned against the table, thinking. How much time? He asked. Maybe a year, Daniel said. Maybe 2. Government projects move slowly, but the planning documents are already in motion. Once it's public, every developer in the state will try to buy land around that route. And you want me to help you hold it until then? Thomas said. Daniel nodded. Thomas crossed his arms and looked at him for a long moment. You understand something, Daniel, Thomas said quietly. This changes everything. How? Daniel asked. Because now I'm not looking at a broken housing project, Thomas said. I'm looking at a land speculation deal based on insider knowledge about a future highway. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. It's not illegal to anticipate city development. It is illegal if someone used non-public information to manipulate land deals and bring in investors without telling them the real reason, Thomas replied calmly. Daniel didn't speak. Thomas walked back to the board and under people wrote in large letters, Who else knows about the highway? Then he underlined it twice. Who are the silent partners? Thomas asked again. Daniel hesitated this time. Really hesitated. That matters, Thomas said, because if I step into this, I step into whatever world they're in too. Daniel walked to the window and looked out, just like he had done before when he didn't want to answer immediately. You ever notice, Daniel said, that the people who make the most money from highways are not the construction companies? Thomas didn't respond. It's the people who own the land before the highway is announced, Daniel continued. They buy cheap, they wait, then the government announces a project. And suddenly farmland becomes commercial property. Empty lots become shopping centers. And everyone acts surprised. Thomas knew that was true. He had made money that way himself legally, by studying public planning trends and buying early. But this felt different. Who are they? Thomas asked again. Daniel turned back to him. One of them is a private investment group, Daniel said. Quiet money. They don't like attention. And the other? Thomas asked. Daniel didn't answer. Thomas waited. Finally, Daniel said, the other one has friends in the city. Thomas felt that cold feeling again in his chest. City Hall? He asked. Daniel didn't say yes, but he didn't say no. Thomas walked slowly back to his chair and sat down. Now the trap looked bigger than he first thought. This wasn't just a failed housing project. This was land. Government planning. Insider information. Investors. Debt. Pressure. And someone trying very hard to bring in a rich partner who could hold the whole thing together until the land value exploded. You know what the problem is now? Thomas said quietly. Daniel looked at him. What? The problem is not whether this deal can make money, Thomas said. The problem is whether it's clean. Daniel didn't answer. Thomas looked at the board again. Land. Money. People. The money could work. The land could be valuable. But the people, that was where deals became dangerous. If I step into this, Thomas said slowly, I need full transparency. Not just documents. Names. Agreements. Who owns what? Who knows what? And who is waiting for that highway announcement? Daniel looked at him for a long moment. If I tell you everything, he said, you're in too deep to walk away. Thomas shook his head slightly. No, if you don't tell me everything, I walk away right now. The room went very quiet. Daniel looked at the whiteboard, at the maps, at the documents, at the words evergreen, truth written across the wall. You really are going to take this whole thing apart, aren't you? Daniel said. Thomas replied calmly, I already have. Daniel stood there for a long time without speaking. Then he finally said something that sounded less like a business negotiation and more like a warning. Thomas, this isn't just about money anymore. Thomas nodded slowly. I know. Daniel held his gaze. Some people involved in this project don't lose well. Thomas thought about Annie, about the broken playground, about the families who had probably once believed those houses would be finished, about the investors who had already lost money, about the land that might soon be worth a fortune because of a highway most people didn't even know about yet. Then he said quietly, I didn't build my life by being afraid of complicated deals. Daniel replied just as quietly, this isn't a complicated deal. Thomas looked at him. It's a dangerous one. Thomas Walker did not sleep much that night. He sat alone in his office long after Daniel left. The war room lights still on, the whiteboard still covered in land maps, debts, names, and red lines connecting everything together like a web. Land, money, people. He had built his career solving problems in those three categories. But this time, the problem was different, because the people were connected to the land, and the land was connected to the government, and the money was connected to all of them. And somewhere in the middle of that web, Daniel had tried to pull him in with a $5 million deposit and a clean-looking report. Thomas walked slowly along the whiteboard again, reading everything like it was a story. Evergreen started as a housing project. The project failed. Investors lost money. The land became tied up in lawsuits and debt. Daniel and his partners bought development rights cheaply. They discovered the future highway plan. They realized the land would become very valuable. They needed money to hold the land until the announcement, so they kept the project alive on paper. And then they started looking for someone rich enough to step in and carry the risk. Someone like Thomas Walker. He stopped in front of the board and said quietly to the empty room, I was never the investor. He paused. I was the exit plan. The next morning, Thomas called Daniel and asked him to come in again. When Daniel arrived, Thomas didn't take him to the war room this time. He took him to his private office and closed the door. I've been thinking, Thomas said. Daniel nodded slowly. That's usually when things get expensive. Thomas ignored the comment. You told me this deal is dangerous. It is, Daniel said. And you told me some people involved don't lose well. Daniel didn't respond, but his face said enough. Thomas walked to his desk and opened a folder, then slid a document across to Daniel. What's this? Daniel asked. A timeline, Thomas said. I wrote down every major event connected to Evergreen for the last 8 years. When the land was bought, when construction started, when funding stopped, when the company went bankrupt, when Evergreen Residential Holdings bought the development rights, when the maintenance spending started, when the photos were taken, and when you started looking for new investors. Daniel looked at the timeline but didn't say anything. You didn't start looking for investors when the project failed, Thomas said. You started looking for investors when you found out about the highway plan. Daniel slowly looked up at him. That's when Evergreen stopped being a housing project, Thomas continued. That's when it became a land play. And that's when you needed a lot more money to hold on. Daniel leaned back in the chair. You figured it out. Yes, Thomas said. But there's still one question I don't have an answer to. Daniel waited. Thomas looked at him carefully and asked, Why me? Daniel didn't answer immediately. You could have gone to any big development company, Thomas continued. Any investment fund, any real estate group. Why come to me personally? Daniel was quiet for a long time. Happy. Then he said, "Free don't just buy land. Free don't for evict broken projects. You negotiate with cities. You settle lawsuits. You finish what other people abandon. You've done it your whole career." "That's not a reason," Thomas said. "That's a description." Daniel looked down at the timeline again, then finally said, "Because if you take over Evergreen, the city will work with you." Thomas didn't move. "Why?" "Because you have a reputation," Daniel said. "You build affordable housing. You finish projects. You don't leave neighborhoods half-built. If you take over Evergreen, the city gets housing. The bank gets paid. The contractors get paid. The neighborhood gets finished. And when the highway comes, the land becomes valuable. Everyone wins." Thomas listened carefully. "Everyone?" he asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. "Most people." Thomas nodded slowly. "And you and your partners make a fortune." Daniel didn't deny it. Thomas walked back to the window and looked out at the city again. Cars moving, people going to work, construction cranes in the distance, new buildings rising, old buildings being torn down. Cities were always changing, and the people who understood where the city was going made the most money. But there was a right way to do it, and a wrong way. "Here's the part I don't like," Thomas said, still looking out the window. "You didn't just bring me a broken project. You brought me a broken project with hidden information, hidden partners, and a deadline you didn't fully explain." Daniel didn't speak. Thomas turned back to him. "You tried to push me to sign before I understood the whole picture. That's what bothers me." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I didn't think you'd even listen if I told you everything at the beginning." "Then you should have tried," Thomas said. The room went quiet again. After a long moment, Thomas said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want the truth." Daniel nodded slowly. "All right. If I had signed that contract the first day," Thomas said, "and wired the $5 million, what would have happened next?" Daniel didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor, then at the timeline, then finally at Thomas. "The money would have gone to Evergreen Residential Holdings," Daniel said. "We would have used it to settle some urgent debts, pay the bank to delay foreclosure, pay the city fees, and keep control of the land." "And my position?" Thomas asked. "You would become the majority financial partner," Daniel said. "Publicly, it would look like you rescued the Evergreen project." "And privately?" Thomas asked. Daniel hesitated. "Privately," he said, "you would be the one carrying the risk if the highway plan changed, or the legal problems got worse, or the city forced a different deal." Thomas nodded slowly. "So I take the risk," Thomas said. "And when the highway is announced, we all make money." "Yes," Daniel said. Thomas walked back to his desk and sat down. "Do you know what this reminds me of?" Thomas asked. Daniel shook his head. "A man falling into a river," Thomas said, "and another man standing on the shore holding a rope." Daniel frowned slightly, not understanding. "The man in the water thinks the rope is there to save him," Thomas said. "But sometimes, the rope is there so the man on the shore doesn't have to jump in himself." Daniel didn't speak. Thomas looked at him calmly. "You didn't just offer me a partnership," Thomas said. "You offered me the rope so I could jump into the river first." The room went completely silent. After a long moment, Daniel said quietly, "Maybe, but if no one jumps, Evergreen dies." Thomas looked at him for a long time, then said something Daniel did not expect. "I'm not afraid of jumping into the river," Thomas said. "I just need to know who's holding the other end of the rope, and whether they plan to pull me out or let go." Daniel did not answer Thomas's question right away. "Who's holding the other end of the rope?" Instead of speaking, he stood up and walked slowly to the window, hands in his pockets, looking down at the city streets far below. From the 24th floor, people looked small. Cars looked like toys, and problems looked simple. But both men in that office knew the problems were not simple. "Do you remember the first building you ever bought?" Daniel asked quietly, still looking out the window. Thomas didn't answer the question. "Don't change the subject." "I'm not," Daniel said. "I'm trying to explain something." He turned back around and leaned against the window. "The first big deal I ever did," Daniel said. "I almost lost everything. I borrowed too much, trusted the wrong contractor, and the market dropped at the worst possible time. I spent 3 years just trying to survive that one mistake." Thomas watched him carefully but said nothing. "That's Evergreen," Daniel continued. One mistake that turned into 10 problems, then into 100 problems, and now it's too big to walk away from. That still doesn't answer my question, Thomas said. Daniel nodded slowly. You want to know who's holding the rope? Yes. Daniel took a deep breath, like a man who had reached the point where not talking was more dangerous than talking. The investment group is called Redline Capital, he said. Private money, real estate, infrastructure, land speculation. They don't like publicity. They invest early, wait, then sell when the big money comes in. Thomas had heard the name before. Quiet money, patient money. The kind of money that didn't lose often because they only played games they understood. And the other partner? Thomas asked. Daniel hesitated again, then said, the other partner isn't officially on paper. Thomas didn't move. Meaning the investment group has connections, Daniel said carefully. People who know things before the public knows them. Planning committees, transportation boards, zoning discussions. Nothing written, nothing illegal on paper, just information that travels early. Thomas leaned back slowly in his chair. So that was the rope. Private money on one end, city connections on the other, Daniel in the middle, and now they wanted Thomas to step in and hold the weight. Do they know you came to me? Thomas asked. Yes, Daniel said. And what do they think about that? Thomas asked. Daniel gave a small, tired smile. They think you're the only person who can make this work. Thomas almost laughed at that. Or the only person rich enough to take the fall if it doesn't. Daniel didn't respond. That silence was answer enough. Thomas stood up and walked slowly around the office, thinking out loud now. If I take this deal, he said, I become the public face of Evergreen. My company finishes the houses. My company deals with the city. My company deals with the bank. My company deals with the contractors. And when the highway is announced, the land value explodes and everyone makes money. Daniel nodded. Yes, and if something goes wrong, Thomas continued. If the highway plan changes, if the city changes zoning, if the lawsuits get worse, if the bank pushes foreclosure, I'm the one in the newspapers. I'm the one in court. I'm the one explaining to investors why the project failed again. Daniel didn't deny it. Thomas stopped walking and looked directly at him. You didn't just bring me into a deal, Thomas said. You brought me into a story. And in that story, I'm either the hero or the villain. Daniel spoke very quietly now. You'd be the man who finished what everyone else abandoned. Thomas shook his head slightly. Or the man who bought a dying project and lost $20 million trying to save it. Daniel didn't argue. The truth was sitting in the room with them now, and neither man could pretend anymore. After a long silence, Thomas said, I want to meet them. Daniel looked up quickly. Who? Redline Capital, Thomas said, and whoever your city friends are. If I'm going to jump into this river, I want to see who's standing on the shore. Daniel's face changed slightly. Not fear, not exactly. More like concern. That's not how they work, Daniel said. They don't do big meetings. They don't like being visible. Thomas nodded slowly. Then the answer is no. Daniel frowned. You're walking away? I didn't say that, Thomas replied. I said if I'm risking my company, my name, and $20 million, I don't do it with ghosts. I need to know who I'm in business with. Daniel walked back to the chair and sat down again, rubbing his hands together slowly. You don't understand how careful these people are, he said. They don't get involved in deals where their names are on documents. They structure things through layers of companies, partnerships, funds. Then they don't need me, Thomas said calmly. Daniel looked at him, frustrated now. They do need you. That's the problem. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Then they can meet me. The room went quiet again. Daniel sat there for a long time, thinking. Finally, he said, if I arrange a meeting, you have to understand something. What? Thomas asked. This won't feel like a normal business meeting, Daniel said. These people don't talk like developers. They talk like people who already know how the story ends. Thomas held his gaze. Good. I'd like to hear the ending before I decide if I want to be in the story. Daniel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, he said. I'll make some calls. He stood up and walked to the door, then stopped before opening it. Thomas, he said without turning around. Most people would have signed that contract on the first day, Thomas replied calmly. Most people didn't have a 6-year-old girl walk into their office and tell them it was a trap. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said, "That kid may have saved you a lot of money." Thomas looked out at the city again and said quietly, "She may have saved me a lot more than that." After Daniel left, Thomas sat alone in his office for a long time, thinking about everything that had happened since the day Annie dropped that folder. One small accident, one child pointing at a picture, one sentence, "Those projects are ghost projects." And now he was sitting in the middle of a deal involving millions of dollars, city planning, private investment groups, and land that might soon be worth a fortune. He opened his desk drawer and took out the evergreen contract again. He looked at the signature line with his name printed neatly at the bottom. Then he picked up a pen and wrote another sentence across the top of the first page, under the words "find out" that he had written days earlier. He wrote, "Who benefits if I sign?" Daniel called 2 days later. "Tonight," he said. "They'll meet you tonight." Thomas didn't ask where. He didn't ask who would be there. He just said, "Send me the address." The address was not an office building. It was a private dining room above an old steakhouse downtown, the kind of place where deals had been made for 50 years without ever appearing in a newspaper. Dark wood walls, low lighting, thick carpet that absorbed sound, and waiters who knew how to disappear when conversations became important. Thomas arrived 5 minutes early. That was his habit. Always arrive early, so you can see who arrives after you. The private room had a long table, but only 3 chairs were set. 3 chairs meant 3 decision-makers. At exactly 7 p.m., the door opened and Daniel walked in with 2 men Thomas had never seen before. The first man was in his late 50s, gray hair, expensive but conservative suit, the kind of face that looked like it had spent 30 years in boardrooms and never once lost sleep over a negotiation. The second man was younger, maybe mid-40s, no tie, just a dark jacket, the kind of man who looked more like a lawyer or a political advisor than a developer. "Thomas," Daniel said, "this is Mr. Carter from Redline Capital, and this is Mr. Hale." They shook hands. Carter's handshake was firm and short. Hale's handshake was lighter, but his eyes were sharp and observant, like he was measuring everything in the room. They sat down. No one ordered food yet. This was not a dinner. This was an evaluation. Carter spoke first. "Mr. Walker," he said, "we've followed your work for years. You have a reputation for finishing projects that other people walk away from." Thomas nodded once. "I don't like leaving things half-built." "That's exactly why we're here," Carter said. Thomas looked at both men, then said calmly, "Before we talk about Evergreen, I want to be very clear about something. I don't invest in projects where I don't understand who I'm in business with and why they're in the deal." Carter gave a small smile. "Fair." Hale leaned back in his chair and said, "Then let's not talk about Evergreen first. Let's talk about the highway." Thomas didn't react on the outside, but inside, that confirmed everything. "You know about it," Thomas said. Hale nodded. "The public announcement will likely happen within 18 months. Environmental review is already in progress. Funding has political support. The route will pass less than a mile from Evergreen." "And land values?" Thomas asked. Carter answered this time. "Triple, maybe more if commercial zoning follows." Thomas folded his hands on the table. "So Evergreen is not a housing project. It's a land position." "Yes," Carter said simply. "And the houses?" Thomas asked. "A tool," Hale said. "A way to keep development rights active, keep the city engaged, and prevent the land from being taken or rezoned without us." Thomas nodded slowly. They were honest now, very honest. "And where do I fit into this?" Thomas asked. Carter leaned forward slightly. "You solve the problems we can't solve." "Which are?" Thomas asked. "The bank," Carter said. "The lawsuits, the contractors, and the city's housing requirements. If Evergreen becomes your project, the city cooperates. If the city cooperates, the permits move. If the permits move, the project survives long enough for the highway announcement." Thomas looked at Hale. "And you help with the city?" Hale didn't smile. "I help people understand each other." That was a political answer if Thomas had ever heard one. "And in return?" Thomas asked. Carter answered calmly. "You get majority ownership once you recapitalize the project. When the highway is announced and the land value increases, we all profit according to our ownership percentages. Thomas leaned back in his chair. So let me say this out loud so we all understand, he said. I invest $20 million to clean up a legal disaster, finish a housing project, and carry the risk for the next 2 years. When the highway is announced, the land value explodes, and we all make a lot of money. Yes, Carter said. And if the highway project is delayed, canceled, or changed? Thomas asked. Carter and Hale exchanged a quick look. Government projects are rarely canceled once they reach this stage, Hale said. That's not what I asked, Thomas replied. Carter answered this time. If the highway doesn't happen, Evergreen is just a housing project with very thin profit margins. You might make a little money, you might break even, but the big profit disappears. So I carry the biggest risk, Thomas said. You carry the operational risk, Carter said. We carry the land position risk. Thomas almost smiled at that. That was a very careful way of saying the same thing. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Thomas said something that changed the tone of the room. Do you know why I haven't signed the contract yet? He asked. Carter shook his head slightly. I assume you're a careful man. Thomas nodded. That's part of it. But the real reason is a 6-year-old girl. All 3 men looked at him, confused. She lives near Evergreen, Thomas said. Her mother cleans offices in my building. She dropped a folder in my office and saw the project photos. She told me the houses didn't look like the pictures. She told me it was a trap. The room went quiet, and that's why we're all sitting here tonight instead of me signing that contract 2 weeks ago, Thomas said. Hale looked at him carefully. You're saying a child stopped a $20 million deal? Thomas shook his head slightly. No. She stopped me from walking into something without asking the right questions. Carter leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas now in a different way. That's why you're dangerous, Carter said. Thomas raised an eyebrow slightly. Dangerous? Yes, Carter said. Because most men at your level think they already know everything. They stop listening. The moment a man stops listening, he becomes easy to lead. Thomas didn't respond. Carter continued. You listen to a child. That means you still pay attention. And men who pay attention are very hard to trap. The word trap hung in the air between them. Thomas looked at each man at the table and said calmly, So now we all understand each other. You need me to save Evergreen and hold the land until the highway comes. I need to know I'm not the only one holding the risk when things go wrong. Carter nodded slowly. That's fair. Thomas leaned forward slightly and said the most important sentence of the night. If I do this, I'm not the rope. I'm not the man in the river. I'm the man holding the knife who decides when to cut the rope if the deal goes bad. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Carter smiled slightly and said, Mr. Walker, now we're finally having the right conversation. When Thomas Walker left the steakhouse that night, he did not feel like a man who had just been offered a deal. He felt like a man who had just been offered a position in a war. Not a loud war, not a public war, but the quiet kind of war where people wore suits, signed documents, moved money, and changed the future of entire neighborhoods without ever raising their voices. He drove home alone. No music, no phone calls, just the sound of the engine and the memory of one sentence Carter had said. Men who pay attention are very hard to trap. Thomas had built his life on paying attention, but this time, he needed to be more than careful. He needed to be smarter than all of them. The next morning, he called a meeting in the war room with his lawyers, financial officers, and 2 people he trusted more than anyone in business, his head of legal, Margaret Ellis, and his chief financial officer, Robert Chen. He didn't show them the glossy evergreen brochure. He showed them the whiteboards, the land map, the debt structure, the ownership structure, the lawsuits, the highway projection line, the list of people involved. When he finished explaining everything, the room was silent. Robert Chen was the first to speak. This is not a real estate deal, he said. Margaret nodded. This is a land control strategy tied to future infrastructure. Thomas nodded. That's exactly what it is. Robert walked closer to the board and looked at the numbers again. If we do this, he said, we're not investing $5 million. We're investing at least 20 to stabilize the project. Maybe more if the lawsuits get ugly. Yes, Thomas said. And the big profit only comes if the highway announcement happens. Robert continued. Yes, and if it doesn't happen, We tie up company capital for years in a low-margin housing project, Robert said. Yes. Margaret crossed her arms and looked at Thomas. So the real question is not whether this can make money. The real question is control. Thomas looked at her. Explain. If you go into this as just an investor, you carry all the risk, and they carry the information, Margaret said. That's a bad position. But if you go in as the controlling partner, full control of the project company, full control of the land negotiations, full control of financing, then you control the timeline and the exit. Thomas nodded slowly. That was exactly what he had been thinking but hadn't said out loud yet. I don't want to be the investor, Thomas said. I want to be the owner. Robert looked at him carefully. That's a very different deal. I know, Thomas said. Which means we rewrite everything. For the next 2 hours, they built a new structure on the whiteboard. Not Daniel's structure. Thomas's structure. Walker Development takes controlling ownership of Evergreen. All land parcels transferred into a new master development company. Bank debt renegotiated under Walker Development. All lawsuits settled under one legal structure. City agreement signed directly with Walker Development for housing completion. Redline Capital becomes minority equity partner, not controlling partner. All silent partners disclosed in legal agreements. No personal guarantees from Thomas. Risk limited to project company. Exit options written into contract if highway project is delayed. Margaret stepped back and looked at the board. If they agree to this, you control everything. And if they don't agree? Robert asked. Thomas picked up a marker and wrote one sentence at the bottom of the board. No deal is better than a bad deal. Then he said quietly, then we walk away. That afternoon, Thomas met Daniel again. This time, he didn't go to the steakhouse. He didn't go to a private room. He didn't go to their territory. He made Daniel come to the war room. When Daniel walked in and saw the whiteboards, the documents, the maps, and the new structure written across the wall, he stopped in the doorway. You've been busy, Daniel said. Thomas nodded. I told you. I don't walk into complicated deals without understanding them. Daniel walked slowly around the room, reading the new structure, the ownership plan, the financing plan, the legal structure. After a few minutes, he turned back to Thomas and said, This isn't a partnership. No, Thomas said calmly. This is a takeover. Daniel studied him carefully. You want controlling ownership? Yes. You want the land titles consolidated under your company? Yes. You want Redline to become minority partners? Yes. Daniel let out a slow breath. They're not going to like that. Thomas shrugged slightly. Then they don't need me. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, then said, You're changing the whole deal. Thomas nodded. Yes. Because the original deal was built to protect you and your partners. This deal is built to protect me and my company. Daniel walked up to the board and pointed at one line. No personal guarantees from Thomas Walker. Risk. Limited to project company. He looked back at Thomas. You really don't trust this deal, do you? Thomas answered honestly. I trust the land. I trust the numbers. I don't trust the situation. Daniel nodded slowly. That's fair. Then he asked the most important question. And what happens to me in this new structure? Daniel asked. Thomas looked at him for a long moment before answering. That depends, Thomas said, on whether you want to keep trying to sell Evergreen or whether you want to help me rebuild it. Daniel frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? It means, Thomas said, you know this project better than anyone. You know the lawsuits, the contractors, the city people, the history, the mistakes. You can either stay the guy who tried to sell me a trap. He paused. Or you can become the guy who helped me turn a ghost project into a real neighborhood. The room went very quiet. Daniel looked around the war room again, the maps, the plans, the numbers, the new structure. You're serious, he said quietly. Thomas nodded. I don't build projects to flip paper. I build places where people live. If I take Evergreen, those houses get finished. That playground gets fixed. That neighborhood stops being a promise and becomes a place. Daniel looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since they met, he didn't look like a salesman. He looked like a man who had been carrying a mistake for a long time and had just been offered a way to fix it. You really would finish it, Daniel said. Thomas answered simply, yes. Daniel nodded slowly, then said, Redline is not going to like losing control. Thomas picked up a marker and wrote one last sentence on the board, in large letters. If they need me, they negotiate. Then he put the marker down and said quietly, set up another meeting. The second meeting with Redline Capital did not happen in a restaurant. This time, it happened in Thomas Walker's war room. That was not an accident. When Carter and Hale walked into the room and saw the walls covered in maps, debt charts, legal structures, and the new ownership model written across the board, they both understood immediately that the balance of power had shifted. This was no longer Daniel's deal. This was Thomas Walker's deal. Carter walked slowly around the room, reading everything in silence. Hale stood near the land map, studying the new structure Thomas had drawn, the consolidation of parcels, the renegotiation plan with the bank, the phased construction schedule, and most importantly, the ownership structure with Walker Development as controlling partner. Finally, Carter turned around and said, "You're not here to invest." Thomas shook his head slightly. "No, you're here to take over," Carter said. "Yes." The room went quiet, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people recalculating numbers in their heads. Hale was the first to speak. "You're asking us to give up control of the land position. I'm asking you to keep the land from collapsing," Thomas said calmly. Carter looked at the board again. "And in exchange, you take controlling ownership of the entire project company." "Yes. And you renegotiate with the bank, settle the lawsuits, finish the housing project, and hold the land until the highway announcement," Carter said. "Yes. And then we all profit based on our new ownership percentages," Hale said. "Yes." Carter looked back at Thomas. "You're changing the risk structure." Thomas nodded. "Yes. Right now, the structure is built so that I carry most of the operational risk, and you keep most of the land upside. That doesn't work for me." "And your structure?" Carter asked. "My structure," Thomas said, "is built so that I control the project, I control the negotiations, I control the timeline, and I control when we sell." Hale crossed his arms. "You want the steering wheel? I want to make sure the car doesn't go off a cliff," Thomas replied. That made Carter smile slightly. "You're a very direct man, Mr. Walker," Carter said. "I don't like surprises," Thomas replied. Carter walked up to the board and pointed to the line that said, "All silent partners disclosed in legal agreements." "That line," Carter said, "is going to be a problem." Thomas didn't move. "Then we don't have a deal." Hale looked at Carter, then back at Thomas. "You don't trust us," Thomas answered honestly. "I don't trust situations where I don't know who has power." That answer hung in the room for a few seconds. Finally, Carter said, "You're not wrong." He walked to the table and sat down slowly. Hale sat across from him. Daniel remained standing near the wall, watching everything like a man watching a chess match where he had once thought he was one of the players, but now realized he had just been a piece on the board. "Let's speak plainly," Carter said. "Evergreen is dying. The bank is getting impatient. The city is losing patience. The contractors want money. The land is valuable, but only if we can hold it long enough. We can't hold it alone anymore. That's why Daniel came to you." Thomas nodded but didn't speak. Carter continued. "If we accept your structure, we lose control. But if we don't accept your structure, the project probably collapses within a year." Hale added quietly. "And if the project collapses, the bank takes the land, the city takes part of it, and the highway comes through anyway. We lose everything." Thomas let them sit with that reality for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I'm not your enemy, but I'm not your rescue boat either. If I come in as the man in charge, not the man paying the bills while someone else makes the decisions." Carter looked at him for a long time. "You know what the difference is between you and most investors we talk to?" Carter asked. Thomas didn't answer. "Most investors ask how much money they can make," Carter said. "You asked who benefits if you sign. That's a different question. That's a power question." Thomas said nothing. Carter leaned back in his chair. "All right," he said finally. "Let's talk about what you're really offering." Thomas walked to the board and pointed to the construction timeline. "Phase 1, he said. "I negotiate with the bank and stop the foreclosure timeline. Phase 2, I settle with the contractors and clear the liens. Phase 3, we restart construction and finish the houses. Phase 4, we stabilize the neighborhood and bring in residents. Phase 5, we wait for the highway announcement. Phase 6, we rezone, and sell part of the land for commercial development. Hale looked at the timeline. That's a 5-year plan. Thomas nodded. Yes. That's a long time, Hale said. Thomas replied calmly. Real money usually takes time. Carter asked, and what do you get at the end of those 5 years? Thomas answered without hesitation. A finished neighborhood, a profitable land position, and control over when we sell, not the bank, not the city, and not the market. Daniel finally spoke from the wall. He's right, he said quietly. If we don't control the timeline, someone else will. Everyone looked at him. Daniel walked slowly to the table and said, we tried to keep Evergreen alive for 2 years with tape and wire. He's talking about rebuilding the whole engine. Carter looked at Thomas again, long and carefully. You're not just trying to make money on Evergreen, Carter said. Thomas shook his head slightly. No. Then what are you trying to do? Hale asked. Thomas thought for a moment before answering. I grew up in a neighborhood where half the houses were never finished, he said. Developers ran out of money. Investors disappeared. Banks took the land. And for 20 years, people lived next to empty lots and broken buildings because someone turned their neighborhood into a failed investment. The room was completely silent now. I don't build ghost projects, Thomas said quietly. If my name goes on Evergreen, those houses get finished. Not because it's the most profitable part of the deal, but because that's the part that makes everything else possible. Carter studied him for a long time, then said something very slowly. You're not just negotiating a deal, Carter said. You're negotiating control of the story. Thomas nodded once. Yes. Carter looked at Hale, then at Daniel, then back at Thomas. Finally he said, all right, Mr. Walker, let's see if we can write a story we all survive. This story reminds us that in life, not every trap looks like a trap. Sometimes it looks like a good opportunity, a fast profit, or a deal that seems too perfect to question. The lesson is simple but powerful. Slow down, ask questions, and always look beyond what people show you. Truth is not always in the documents, the presentations, or the promises. Sometimes truth lives in the places people don't want you to look. The story also teaches us something deeper about character. Real success is not just about making money, but about what you choose to build, who you choose to protect, and whether you leave things better than you found them. In the end, the most important voice in this story was not a billionaire, a banker, or an investor. It was a 6-year-old girl who was honest enough to say, something is not right. And sometimes in life, the people with the smallest voices are the ones telling the biggest truth. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.